Kia ora. Welcome back, e te iwi. Thank you for allowing those 3 minutes so I can sit in front of the aircon and cool down. It is a bit muggy here in Tāmaki Makaurau, Auckland. But please, we have a lot more amazing kōrero coming up, so let's get right back into it. So our next speaker is Nicholas Jones of the tribes of Ngai Tūhoi and Ngāpuhi. He is a PhD candidate in social anthropology at Waipapa Taumatarau, the University of Auckland. As a research assistant at the James Henare Research Centre, he has experience in a range of kaupapa Māori, Māori-led community-based research projects. He has worked on projects examining kaumātua health, that's Māori elders' health and well-being, the uptake of integration of technology, and artificial intelligence amongst Māori agricultural businesses and Māori data sovereignty. There we are, so much beautiful big words. E te iwi, ho mai te piki paki paki. Nicholas Jones. Kia ora, Nicholas. Sorry about that. Thank you.
Kia ora tātou. Ko maunga puhatu te maunga, ko tauranga te awa, ko Ngai Tūhoi, no Ngāpuhi, ko iwi. So my name is Nicholas Jones. I'm actually an imposter at AUT today. I belong over at Auckland Uni. Kia ora toi. But today I'm going to be presenting a little bit of research that I've done during our COVID-19 lockdowns that we experienced. This research was done in collaboration with a bunch of kaumātua from our research centre, and they got to see the final of everything. So in that way, touching on tangaroa's kōrero, it's very kaupapa Māori led. Just a warning, this talk will pick up on some of Hini Matau's material, so we will be discussing a little bit about tangihanga. So just an FYI. So let's get into it. Before I'll start the final talk, I'll put some context around it. So the outbreak of COVID-19 and its accompanying restrictions saw a lot of media talking about how this was unprecedented times. And I had straight away an issue with that, because from memory, plagues have always been around. And what I started to see in the media is what I started to think of as more selective collective amnesia. However, I didn't think that this applied to all New Zealanders. During the course of my research with these kaumātua, I actually found that this did not apply at all to kaumātua. Rather, kaumātua expressed sentiment that this was not unprecedented times at all. They reflected that the challenges presented by COVID-19 and its accompanying restrictions were not new to Māori. For kaumātua, the government restrictions to tackle epi and pandemics fall into a pattern that has often targeted Māori cultural practices in times of disease. In particular, so I've got a bit of a glossary there for you. So kaumātua, of course, are our Māori elders. They are our leaders in our communities. Hongi is the pressing of noses, the touching noses, and the exchanging of hau. It cements our relationships together when we come together to hongi. And tangihanga are our funerary rites. But what I found in doing this research with kaumātua is that they drew upon a complex intergenerational memory corpus of diseases of the past. Kaumātua pulled not only from their own life experiences, experiencing diseases such as tuberculosis, typhoid, HIV, all those kinds of hekeke that have turned up, but also of the experience and lessons that have been passed down by their tipuna, or their ancestors. And this helped to inform their response to COVID-19. So, here I thought we'll start with a little bit of a history lesson. I did do my undergraduate fully in history, so I am a little bit skewed towards history in that regard. So, much of the, well, particularly in the earlier 20th century, Māori customs, particularly tangihanga and hongi, were often singled out and targeted, and often outright blamed by the New Zealand public health officials and the New Zealand public in general for the disease spread and worsening of public health. Māori were condemned for attending large hui or gatherings. That was absolutely not going to be permitted during subsequent pandemics. However, no custom came under attack more by the public than tangihanga, or Māori funerary rites. Tangihanga were condemned by non-Māori because of its potential danger in spreading infectious disease. During tangi, it's expected that we express our hupe, so that is our saliva, our snot and all that. It's part of the grieving process, and it's also part of the koha process. And shedding our hupe, we're showing our love, our aroha, for those that have passed and their whānau. So early on, many Pākehā reformers urged the Department of Health to abolish tangihanga by law. But another cultural practice that was looked upon disapprovingly so, but never, the government was very hesitant to enforce restrictions on this, but that was hongi. There was a lot of public sentiment out there where a lot of non-Māori absolutely did not understand hongi and thought that, again, it was spreading diseases. As Angela Wanhala says, that poor Māori health outcomes was explicitly connected to Māori cultural practices. So there's just a few selections there. Now, the point of the hongi, as I've got here, for many Māori, the hongi is extremely important. In the pressing of noses and the exchanging of hau, the hongi functions as a symbol of peace and a sign of life and well-being where manuhiri, or guests to our marae, and tangata whenua can come together. Now, hongi is still so important to us that one kaumātua during the course of our research, reflecting on hongi being restricted during COVID-19, saying the hongi is huge to us. The connection of a person, it's not just the face, it is also a connection to our ancestors. So while politicians and medical health officials mainly directed their attention to restricting hui and tangihanga, they continue to treat hongi with suspicion. And then we had the big issue, which was the 1918 influenza pandemic. So the outbreak of influenza in New Zealand brought about huge changes for Māori and Māori customs that have lingered to now. Influenza disproportionately took a much heavier toll on Māori. In total, over 2,160 Māori passed away during this pandemic, with the Māori death rate being 42.3 per 1,000, compared with the European rate of 5.5 per 1,000. This impact of influenza was etched into the memory of Māori. With many whānau members passing, hardly no one was impacted by the virus. In their attempts to curb the impacts of influenza on Māori, health officials temporarily prohibited tangihanga from occurring. These prohibitions did not apply to European or non-Māori tangi. So they were allowed to absolutely continue as per usual. It was Māori that were restricted. The banning of tangihanga lasted well beyond 1918 itself, with some tangihanga prevented from going ahead even in the 1920s on these grounds of influenza. In the wake of the influenza virus and with sporadic outbreaks of other diseases, the 1920s and 30s saw health officials and the Māori Council moving to formally regulate the tangihanga process. Rather than lasting for an extended and non-specified number of days, so we would often have tangihanga that could last months on end, in which the tūpāpaku or the deceased would be out and to allow manuhiri to come in time to gather. So that was gone, and instead it was limited to a body could remain if it was uninfectious for up to 4 days. That then subsequently got altered to 3 days, which a lot of tangihanga now run to 3 days. And also, these days tightened in the summer months. That's when it went down to 3 days, which just became quite common. So, what I saw is when I'm going through a bunch of different newspapers, a bunch of different academic articles, and just the epidemiological history of in New Zealand, I started to see a pattern of restrictions. Subsequent to the 1918 influenza pandemic, tangihanga continued to be the target of health restrictions in time of disease. Likewise, hongi has continued to be looked upon with suspicion and has been discouraged during these times. So, as you can just see there, it keeps popping up, and it's popped up very recently as we're talking about swine flu, bird flu, and then most recently COVID. So we'll move into COVID. So, feeding into this pattern, the arrival of COVID-19 to Aotearoa shores saw tangihanga and hongi brought again into the public health discourse, and it was politicised. In its attempt to limit the spread of COVID-19, government-directed public health restrictions prohibited gatherings from taking place. Included in this decree was also the prohibition of formal tangihanga from going ahead or private whānau tangihanga at home going ahead. At Alert Level 4, no gatherings could take place, including the viewing of a tūpapaku or attending the burial itself. Government officials went so far as to try and persuade you to not stand even at the gates of the urupa to farewell your loved one. Public health officials also asked funerary directors to carry out burials and cremations as quickly as possible, preferably in 1 day, which again did not allow enough time for manuhiri to actually gather together and collect their thoughts. Public health officials and politicians also discouraged hongi. They adopted a lighter tone this time instead of outright saying, don't hongi, don't be dirty. Instead, they adopted a tone of adopt waving and smiling. The Prime Minister suggested adopting the East Coast wave, or the raising of the eyebrows, instead of a hongi. We'll have to run that past those ones up north. So while the situation and patterns of restrictions posed by pandemics of the past have largely faded from the collective memory of most New Zealanders, with most New Zealanders reflecting during COVID, there was no kōrero whatsoever coming out about the 1918 influenza or any other pandemics. They did not think about the tuberculosis campaign, which ordered them to be inoculated against tuberculosis, and now we have anti-vax issues, of course. So, what I found though is that this fading of memory, it does not apply to kaumātua at all. While speaking to kaumātua, it became apparent that these experiences of past epi and pandemics have become etched into their intergenerational memory corpus. Kaumātua made comparisons with disease restrictions and mitigation methods across a broad span of time, including those outside of their life experiences, particularly drawing on the 1918 influenza pandemic. Many of our kaumātua at that time were not actually born then. Rather than being unprecedented times, kaumātua reflected that the situation posed by COVID-19 and its accompanying restrictions, again, were nothing new. And this is most imbued in this quote here by one of my kaumātua participants, a kuio, or a female Māori elder, as we'll call them. So she explicitly notes, the restrictions are not new, we are accustomed to them. She's been through this many times before. It's not her first rodeo. So, now I have these two images here. One is to actually show how memory is also carved into, for Māori, we create po for memory. This particular po here is a commemoration of the 1918 influenza pandemic, and it was up a lot longer before the most recent 2021 unveiling of the commemoration for the 1918 influenza pandemic. The second image is during tuberculosis, and this is a health hut. So if you had tuberculosis back in the day, you would be isolated you had a hut at the back of the house, you got shoved over there, and it was your whānau that had to look after you. You would get regular attendance from a nurse, but that was it. Your whānau fed and watered you there. But just to say there that actually isolating for Māori, again, nothing new. There is an experience there. So, rather than having collective amnesia, kaumātua showed their memory crosses lifespans and covers experiences of many disease outbreaks. As leaders, kaumātua are the holders of mātauranga. They are the conduit between the experiences of our tipuna and us. As cultural custodians, their knowledge and life experiences is critical to our survival now. They hold not only the experiences living through large pandemics such as tuberculosis and AIDS, but also the experiences of their tipuna. These experiences have been passed down as taonga tuku iho, or treasures to be passed down. When COVID-19 arrived in Aotearoa, Maru Hapu, Marae and whānau looked towards the leadership of our kaumātua to help guide us through this pandemic and its accompanying restrictions, particularly in regards to navigating tikanga Māori. Kaumātua galvanised to protect the survival of the collective, and the survival, and particularly this is one thing they emphasised, the survival of whakapapa or genealogy was of their prime concern. Tapping into the intergenerational memory corpus, Māori elders drew on the pandemic experiences of their tempuna encoded in this corpus. In particular, they reflected on the devastation caused by the influenza outbreak. Releasing this collective intelligence held in these intergenerational memories, these memories assisted kaumātua in their overall response to COVID-19 itself. So in that regard, taking the threat very seriously, kaumātua from around the country galvanised together to provide a united and tikanga-based response to the pandemic. During the first wave of COVID-19 in Aotearoa and lockdown being imposed, kaumātua assisted marae in organising cooking and distributing kaipaks to whānau and other kaumātua in their rohe while following public health restrictions. Kaumātua stressed the seriousness of COVID-19 to their whānau and their communities, with many Māori communities closing their rohe borders or their regional borders and imposing roadblocks to prevent COVID-19 from entering the community. This was only done because of the stress that kaumātua put on the impacts of pandemics on Māori. When capacity limitations were imposed on tangihanga, this is when we were allowed to recongregate in a limited capacity, some kaumātua adapted tikanga to allow tangihanga to be streamed online. When physical contact was discouraged, kaumātua okayed practices such as hongi being suspended in favour of an elbow bump or the like. When vaccinations became available, kaumātua encouraged and supported marae to adjust their tikanga to provide COVID-19 testing and vaccinations, alongside giving their rangatahi a boot to go and get the vaccination itself. And then second to last slide, so this is a very big concept that stuck out to me when going through the interviews. Kaumātua reflected on the intergenerational concepts passed down by their tipuna that have informed both their own and the community's approach to hauora or health. Most notably, they reflected on, particularly on the laws of tapu, or what we would say is sacred, or set apart, and its emphasis on hygiene. Tapu dictates the need for the separation of that is what is tapu from that is what is noa, or common or everyday. As one courier remarked here, you don't put things on the table, your shoes and socks and certain things like that. There was just a place for each kind of activity. When COVID-19 restrictions loosened enough to allow limited capacity at tangihanga, kaumātua stressed the state of tapu of the tūpāpaku or the deceased to visitors. One kuia interviewed explained that during tangihanga, in which an estimated 250 to 300 people attended, her iwi required whānau and manuhiri to sign at a register and escorted groups through in lots of 20 for a brief mihi-mihi or to pay tribute before being provided takeaway kai. In doing so, iwi and hapu were able to mitigate and limit the possibility of intermixing of potential infectious bodily fluids, which are also considered tapu themselves, amongst mourners. But so too did they inhibit and confine contact with a potentially infectious tūpapuku. Moreover, they stressed in observing tapu regulations when leaving the marae itself, placing the marae in a state of tapu so that way everyone that left the marae, according to tikanga Māori, should wash their hands. In this way, this tikanga Māori and tapu in particular aligned with public health measures. So, in conclusion, experiences of diseases have worked their way into part of Māori intergenerational memory corpus. Kaumātua hold access to this valuable intergenerationally built mātauranga and have wielded it to help guide their communities during times of disease. This mātauranga and the encoded lessons intergenerationally worked into tikanga Māori. The experience of their tipuna and these memories and values continue to be handed down as taonga tuku iho and hold the potential to unlock a number of solutions and approaches to challenges of the future, not just in pandemics. So on that note, I'll leave it there. Ngā mihi nui.
Kia ora, Nicholas. Stay here, jump on this side. And then I'll put that there. So, you actually answered it a little bit in there, but I just want to bring back to it. So this one's from Brazil. Brazil has one of the highest mortality rates in the world during the COVID, and Indigenous people was one of the most affected. How have Māori in New Zealand created strategies to spread communication to avoid destructive elements coming from fake news? How were Māori affected by COVID-19 in New Zealand, and elaborating on those strategies?
Thank you. Okay, to your first point. How have Māori been, galvanising each other to actually tackle COVID? So, again, this is where we look to the leadership of our kaumātua, and a lot of us took the direction of our kaumātua about that. It was about, at the end of the day, we didn't really care what the government was saying. It was up to what our elders said. So if they decided that they followed government restrictions, then we would follow government restrictions. Now, I will note that actually the tangihanga that was held was not during when it was loosened. That was during the height of the COVID pandemic. That's when full lockdown was going ahead, but the iwi managed to mitigate that health risk on their own because of these experiences. So I think one point is, again, looking to our elders in order to get that. They're the ones that can kind of galvanise us, they're the ones that can give the boot to the right people, and they have such deep connections across the entire collective that they know the right levers to pull. What was the second part though?
Nice, and it sort of links into this next question, Nicholas. Looking back in time, but right back, do you think past experiences such as the pandemics like the Spanish flu contributed for vulnerable groups like Māori to respond more effective? Do you think, and do you have any vaccination strategies focused for Māori? Minister.
Kia ora. Well, unfortunately on that note, the government they kind of mucked that one up. So they did not take into consideration that New Zealand as a whole is an ageing population, but the Māori population is actually a young population. And so they were vaccinating all of our kaumātua, our kuia, krauas, and a lot of the older Pākehā generation, but they were totally overlooking the majority of the Māori population. Then what we also saw was a lack of Māori representation in delivering the messages itself, and that was a big, big issue. We responded a lot better to a feisty kaumātua up there just telling you hurry up and get down there, and they're like, you can't come to the marae and you can't come and have the kai and you can't come see whānau until you hurry up and go do it, then fluffy messages of being kind and we're all in this together, kumbaya. So, in that regard, yeah. Put them on the stage, I say.
Ai, ko mai te paki, o Nicola, kia ora rā. Nō reira e te whānau, we have another few minutes just to reset. So 3 more minutes and we'll be back live, so stay tuned and we'll see you after this commercial break. No, there's no commercials. There's no commercials. Kia ora. 3 minutes.